Welcome back to this Oral History podcast series, a journey through the past, present, and future of mining, and to the 10th podcast, where we explore some of the most pressing issues in mining and sustainability. I'm your host, Mónica Ospina, joined by my co-host, Priscilla Nelson. Today, we are diving into the fascinating discussion of the value and impact of sustainability reporting in the mining industry. Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson are with us to share their deep insights into whether these reports are just a box to check, they truly inform investment decisions and drive meaningful change within companies.
That's right, Monica. This conversation digs into the heart of some critical questions. Are sustainability reports genuinely helpful, or are they just another formality? And what about the disconnect between the promises made on paper and the realities on the ground? Luke highlights the importance of legally enforceable agreements as essential for maintaining trust and long-term relationships with communities. And we'll also explore the role of short-term financial goals versus long-term sustainability, and how this impacts both corporate decision-making and community relationships. Glenn and Luke bring real-life stories that illustrate the complexities companies face when trying to balance profitability with responsibility.
One of the interesting questions, I think, Luke, that we need to talk about is the enormous amount of energy and effort that's gone into developing reporting throughout the industry, but particularly sustainability reports being prepared by individual companies. And I guess the question that is on my mind is to what extent the development of those tools actually is informing the public generally, but more importantly, different communities of interest that have a direct interest, and most critically, whether it is actually having any influence on financial decisions and opportunities for finance and investment into these companies. Are these just paper, or are they really a practical, useful tool? What's your thought on that?
Well, people in the mining industry must think that this is useful to them and important because mining has been a leader, for example, in the Global Reporting Initiative. Mining companies were among the first to support the creation of the GRI. And then as they started developing sector-specific reporting standards, V1 and then V2, and mining was the first to have its own sector-specific reporting standards because people involved in the mining industry thought it was important. Mining was, I think it's true, the first sector to have a second iteration of their own sector-specific standard. So there's a push. The mining industry has demonstrably been a leader in this field, and so I think it's really worth taking a look at what it is that companies thought they were achieving, why this is being done. Companies complain that they put all this effort into this, and then it's not like the Rio Tinto sustainability report is on the New York Times bestseller list. There's not a hell of a lot of people who read these, and then the question is, do the people in the finance world pay any attention? My suggestion is that whether they do or not, that many of the best mining companies think it's an important internal discipline to have everybody focus on this issue and think about what they're doing and whether it could be done better and put it on paper, even if no one outside the company pays any attention. But do you see any sign that people in the finance world are paying attention to this?
Well, only anecdotally. I know a close colleague of mine was a very senior vice president, executive of this whole area, including financial relationships for the firm. He had quite a different view. He didn't believe that the European investment bankers that he visited 3 or 4 years ago paid any attention to it at all. and he confronted them basically because all he could see was that they were responding in their inquiries of him and the challenges they gave to him from press reports on different NGO stories that had come forward into the European papers, and that was far more preoccupying their interest. So it really goes down to a question of risk, in the sense that for a lot of these companies and financial institutions, including down the supply chain, the real risk is not having a good housekeeping seal of approval, but are we having a lot of negative stories that are hitting the ground, and those are reaching the public mind? And the question is, are those helpful in any way? He was in a meeting with all of these financial people, and I was in the room. And he said, look, I'm prepared to put myself on the operating table here with my report, and I want you to do a full diagnostic on it, because I want to know that you're actually using this stuff, because we're investing a huge amount of money and resources that could be deployed more capably, in his view, on the ground, as opposed to filling out paper. And on some of the things he said, there's no use you reading this paper. He invited them all to actually come to the mine site and open up the mine site for them to come and actually examine all of the procedures and activities that have been in place, so that they could make their own judgments, not judgments from 2,500 or 4,000 kilometers away in Europe about whether they should have confidence in the way the mine was being managed from a risk point of view. So that's an anecdotal story. But it was a very real story to him, and I think there's a lot of kernels of truth in there, in the sense that there's no doubt that a bad story in a newspaper catches your attention a lot more if you're in the finance game, or if you're an NGO, or if you're a member of the public, than a sustainability report.
Well, I suppose on some level, yes, you're right. It is the attention-grabbing headline about some horrible disaster, that really has everybody's attention. And the justification for all this work in social performance is that we all know you can't eliminate risk, but that if you're really rigorously trying to do the right thing, by getting certified by IRMA or whatever, it may not eliminate risk, but it dramatically reduces the risk that there will be that headline. Do we, by paying attention to all of these requirements and putting in place management systems to manage them, wind up lowering risk? And I have to think, to some extent, we do. But the rigorous evidence that companies that invest in management systems to ensure strong social performance and environmental performance have less risk? I think so, but how do we prove that?
I agree. The other thing that's been told to me in other contexts is that so much of the work that could conceivably be done right at ground zero, working in communities and with them, is consumed in preparing these major reports that take up a lot of internal resources to develop them. And they're not developed across the breadth of the company typically. They're developed very much in the social performance reporting unit that's usually attached to something around social and community relations. And so it raises the real question, is this driving home the fundamental point that sustainability really needs to be owned by everyone from the CEO down? Is sustainability something like safety that has to run as a cornerstone value no matter where you are on the internally within the organization? Is the sustainability reporting exercise actually driving home that set of values? Is there a sustainability kind of call out at the beginning of every meeting, just like there is in many major corporations for safety related issues? those are the kind of questions that run through my mind as being potential target zones for some in further consideration. Yeah. Is the effort worth it, or are you getting better value elsewhere that can generate more authentic stories on the ground as opposed to the world of data?
The other question, of course, is what is going on with the people in the finance world? And I think we really need to shine the spotlight on that. I had a talk with someone who's very close to me who works in the banking world. And he said, you would be terrified if you knew how thoughtless a lot of these decisions are, and above all, how short term they are. He said, a lot of the sustainability reporting and things is about people who are trying to build value over the long run. But he said, the people I work with, he said, Wednesday is the long run. Their future horizon has absolutely nothing to do with building value over the next 2, 3, 5 years. It has to do with what kind of a return can we get in a few days, shifting shares back and forth. If that's who's running our economy, we really are in trouble, right? And we have to ask that question of who is running our economy. Maybe that is at the core of a lot of the bigger problems our societies are facing, is very, very short-term focus on trying to make a killing financially, and almost no thought of what's going to happen 6 months from now.
Well, there's no doubt that's a generic issue running across our entire economic fabric, because the stock markets run on reports. We watch for reporting, earnings reports constantly. Everything in our world tends financially to be based in terms of the popular consumption of financial information, and much of the markets themselves, depending on the kind of fund philosophy in this place, is on short-term returns, and that's why they see volatility. There is another area here, though, that I think needs to be turned over, and that's the question that I have heard, that without these sustainability reports, that becomes a critical parameter in measuring executive pay. That without a sustainability report that looks and feels positive, that finds its way to the board of directors, that there is no real groundwork for measuring performance, and that becomes a critical element. I guess the first of these parameters these filters that was created was by the Dow Jones in 1998, and since then we've had many other of these filtering organizations operating in a variety of ways that are sort of like black box magic to me. But I don't think there's any doubt but that they are principal informers of executive compensation from the information that I've heard. And it certainly doesn't look good if you don't have a good social sustainability report when you report in for your annual performance review.
And this is one of the limits of sustainability reporting, right? Is in most companies, there isn't like an independent voice questioning what goes into the report, right? There is in some companies, but basically, if there's somebody up at the top putting the squeeze on the sustainability reporting people to try to find language that makes everything sound terrific, if there's just pressure to try to make everything sound good and there's no countervailing voice in the company, that's one of the limitations of sustainability reporting, right?
And I guess if you really looked at it the way I was mentioning earlier in our conversation, if you want to engage differently externally, you have to engage and think differently internally. And let me just give you an example so I can drive into the full impact of that meeting. Here's a classic example. It's been told more than once. There's a mine, Northern Ontario. There's a commitment made by a mine manager to sole source fuel from a local bulk dealership owned by the particular community. That followed months of negotiation to break a roadblock that had been operating in connection with the operation. And no sooner had the commitment been made to the community, but that a directive came from the VP of procurement out of Montreal saying that we have entered into a global purchasing arrangement with Exxon. Now, clearly, we have mixed signals going in different directions, but clearly the VP of procurement says, well, you're going to have to cancel the arrangement that you've made with the community. Well, there's a classic example that highlights multiple issues within organizational structures where there's cross signals, because the real essence of sustainability needs to have an organizational mirror that reflects the extent to which it requires integrated thinking up and down. And you cannot simply move on one trajectory without having regard for its implications in another facet of the business. And the difficulty with breaking commitments to communities is they have long memories. Companies' memories are shorter, and differential memory is a very major factor in all of these kinds of considerations. And that's just one example of how one would ask, can you really do a sustainability report without doing a diagnostic of why some of the issues internally arose? What were the challenges, and how are we responding to those?
When they developed the big copper mine at Bajo de Alumbrera in northern Argentina, I think it's the largest mine in Argentina. They had a consortium of 4 companies that had interests in the project, and the agreements among these companies were that a certain group of companies would manage the development of the mine, and then once it was operating, it would be turned over to a different group of companies. The companies that did the initial mine development, I think, were doing a really terrific job in, community relations and community development. And there were quite a lot of really interesting things that were done in the community. And then, unfortunately, when the mine was deemed to be operational and they put it over to these other companies, the management changed and the management approach changed. And I remember, it was very hot out there in the summer, and so they encouraged some local merchant in this really very remote little crossroads where the highway went. They told him, we're going to want a lot of ice cream bars. Our workers are going to want really a lot of ice cream bars. And he said, well, I don't have any way to sell anymore because I've only got this little freezer. And they made him a loan to buy a whole bunch of bigger freezers so that he could stock more ice cream bars so that their workers could eat ice cream. And he did that, and he bought all the freezers and filled them full of ice cream. And then he sent in the bill to the company, and they said, there's been a change of management structure, and all bills now must be sent to this address in Australia and expect payment in 180 days. Right? And so this guy who was investing in the ice cream freezers wound up basically going broke because a commitment made by the company management to help and support him, wound up being, as you point out, taken over by some finance people. I went down there. The World Bank asked me to go down there and talk to their management about this. And I said, I see you're buying, almost 1,500 eggs a day, and you have the corporate jet flying them in from Buenos Aires. And there's chicken farmers all over this region who would like to be selling you eggs. You're not buying anything locally. You're having it flown in on the corporate jet. And the guy said, I went to school to study mining engineering, not to study how to organize chicken co-ops. And none of these producers is big enough to provide us with that many eggs. And I'm damned if I'm going to spend 5 minutes organizing chicken co-ops. Changes in corporate management is a huge issue. You know, people make these incredible deals with communities, and then suddenly the company has different management or is taken over by different interests, and suddenly all of these agreements the community has reached that they thought were a great victory have no value.
So that's a perfect example. Is that responsible mining? So there's two kind of streams that you need to look at this whole question through, and I don't think we're doing justice to them. One is obviously the physical management of the reality of a mine and how it is developed, opened, operated, and how it's sensitive to the environment and proximity of the natural world around it. Then there's also the whole question of how responsible are its relationships with the communities. So we need different parameters to measure that. We could take a spill out of a tailings pond. That's pretty clearly raises a very serious question about responsible mining. However one describes it at the most dramatic range, that's a question that's on the table. Is the question of the ice cream truck any less significant through the eyes of the person that was given an assurance, or at least a reasonable expectation, that was taken away? Because what kind of poisonous attitude does that pour into the social fabric? You can't trust these guys. Is that the kind of thing that's showing up and dealt with? So take this example, the Cerro Verde mine in Arequipa, and Freeport has a major property there. I was there once, and it was impressive because they were building a collaborative relationship with respect to the operation of the water facility, and part of the operational competency of the mine related to water purification and management, and they shared that with the local community. So I was really there to look at that. But in the course of that, a variety of other issues in the penumbra around the mine became clear, and it's not necessarily directly related to Freeport, but it's this. So there had been a lot of potential for a further mine to be developed there. And there was exploration work. There was a lot of activity going on in terms of starting the whole approval process. And there'd been major political commitments made by certain of the political players in the community that had put them way out front from where they were typically comfortable being. But they had become convinced that, almost against their better judgment, that this was a political call they were prepared to make and to stake a lot of optimism in the future around it. And it was respected very significantly, I know, by those people who had been for the mine, and they realized what a difficult political decision this had been made. Well, no sooner had that person made the political decision than within 6 months, it was announced that the mine would not go forward. So all of these expectations remained unfulfilled, and basically he had given up all his political capital. It's a multi-headed way that it can rebound on you. The expectation, and then it's unfulfilled, and a political capital has been lost. Is that reported in the sustainability report? Second example, when I was really reflecting on all of these different kind of dynamics that I'd been in, I decided in 2012 that the only way to build a robust conversation was to take it upon myself to try to pull together with some very good friends like Jim Cooney, and I involved Luke in building what I called GEM, Global Energy Mines Minerals Dialogues. I concluded soon that in my mission to pull together anywhere from 40 to 150 people, I'd need to raise a significant amount of money. The University of Simon Fraser gave me about a third, and I raised the rest. And we brought in a Mexican set of colleagues that were across the whole spectrum, from environmentalists to companies to social NGOs to the whole gambit. And there was about 40, and that was our first one. But slowly, and this is where I'm going, slowly I came to realize that to really build a robust, meaningful conversation, and we were now working up to 150 people, about 40 of whom were flowing in from all over the world, we would have to, in my view, create something other than case studies in order to probe deeply into what really was going on and how we would be able to move to the next level of conversation to dig deeply into these problems. So I wrote a 50-minute script, and I'm coming to this very point about the discontinuity of mining operation, that started in 1972 in the video, and I had actors that played these roles. The video was running. Everything was simulated from all of the script that I knew and understanding, and it traced through the evolution of that mine over the first period of junior development, then intermediate mine in the 1990s, and went back to right to the major point of 2014, when it was a huge multinational corporation. Now, why am I going into that? The entire issue could only be understood as it presented from the community point of view, given the differential memory that the community was bringing forward from some inappropriate activity that had taken place when the company was a junior. With the young girls in the community. That was as live today in 2014 as it had been in 1972. And that became a way of demonstrating how challenging looking at these things are across different culture. The intermediate mine had gone bankrupt and left a whole slew of junk and and turmoil in the community. So unless you look at this longitudinally in a lot of these cases, you can't really get a handle on it as just a slice in time. So I apologize for being too long on that, Luke, but you can't just take a slice at time, because the community's memory stretches lot longer than the corporate memory has any ability to grasp.
Well, this is a really important principle. It's a cultural issue, right? That the world I live in here in the United States, I'm dealing with somebody, he's a dean of my department at the university or someone like that. And next week I hear, oh no, the dean has resigned and we've got a new dean.
Right.
And okay, well, in general, I expect we can just take up this issue I was working on and it will continue to move forward with a new dean, because people are kind of fungible in these roles. And if you go into a community and you want to either say, well, here I am, and they say, no, we've been dealing with this guy for the last 2 years and we've gotten comfortable with him. Where is he? Oh, I'm his replacement. The credibility doesn't just automatically transfer over, particularly in subsistence kind of communities.
Right.
The relationships are with people, not with roles. And one of the things I did want to hit on was a little exercise we did where we started to talk about what point in the development process did relationships start to go sour, looking at cases where they became very conflictive. Where did things start to go sour? We went through a bunch of these discussions with a bunch of really experienced people who'd spent a lot of time at mine sites. The basic answer was when some commitment is not kept, right? The classic example, and some people told me this is the most common classic example in the industry, is that people in a little village start getting upset because the big trucks drive by on the dirt road and kick up all this dust, and you wash your laundry and hang it on the line, and by the time the laundry's dry, it's dirty again because of all the dust. And so at some point, somebody in the village complained, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, well, we'll take care of that. We'll pave the road so it doesn't throw dust on you." And time passes and nothing happens, and ultimately, they start talking to people who say, "Well, I'm just a truck driver. That's not my job." And they never can figure out whose job it was, and and at this point, they start getting really, really upset. The truck's running over the chickens, and the promise will compensate you for the chickens that never gets kept. That kind of concern is the origin of the grievance mechanism requirement, right? That now the IFC performance standards require that every project has to have a known grievance mechanism where you can take issues like that and get a response. That's one point I want to make. And beyond that, the next point is enforceability of the agreements over time. One of the problems we have is an awful lot of these agreements that are reached between companies and communities aren't in a form where there's any kind of enforceability.
I guess going backwards here, the best way to deal with a grievance is not to have one. And
Right.
So how you build proactive structures that are built within the relationship that you've got at whatever level it is, but the more substantial the relationship is, the more likely that the parties will have anticipated ways of dealing with communication breakdowns and safety valves in their relationship. Because if what we're relying on is, like too often in labor law, recourse to arbitration and grievance, we've already got a problem. So once you're at that point, so that's why sustainability has to be owned by everyone in the organization. Once you start seeing sustainability through a social lens, you have to look at it in a very different way, because every part of the interaction between the community and the mine is a potential trouble zone. That's the bottom line. And it's interesting, roads have been preoccupying me in my career. If you look at northeastern BC, where we have a lot of big gas processing plants, and I've worked in the middle of those issues up there for many years. In every one of those cases, when a big plant is being built, what do you think the first thing is that's going to start happening? Big trucks are going to start moving onto the site long before there's any construction at all. And there's going to be trucks barreling down small country roads in ranch country, and there's going to be school buses on the roads. And there's going to be school buses that are threatened. Then there's going to be side windows taken off by some zooming truck running down the road. An old guy has to clean his car every morning because it's filled with dust. So I'm an expert on the dust business. And every time I deal with these companies up there, I say the first thing is, we got to get the dust under control, because that's the first marker of trouble coming. It's always the way. So that becomes a more complicated problem, though, because then the question is, who has jurisdiction over the trucks on the road? Well, that involves the municipality. And then we get into the question of the RCMP. Then we get into the question of the road contractor. That's people, but it's a municipal responsibility to deal with it. So you have to create a side table in which you bring all these people to the table to deal with the dust problem. Now, this all seems crazy, but the fact is that if you really had a sustainability report that diagnosed the road problem and the dust problem, now we would be getting somewhere. And who in the hell is managing that internally to get under control?
I've got to share this example because it so closely fits with what you're saying, and because it was brought to me by a person who who we used to work with years ago, but he wound up being the vice president for sustainability of a company headquartered in Canada. And at any rate, the issue was they needed to get some drill crews to go out and drill a site. And the road that went out there went right through the front yard of an isolated ranch house that was owned by a very deeply religious Mormon family who had been ranching this area for 4 generations. And they went and talked to the family and said, here's what we want to do. We want to come through here. There are going to be trucks. The family said, well, look, we know you have a legal right to go through here. We really rather this wasn't happening, but the only requests we really have are, first of all, the trucks have to go slowly. We want them to slow down to, less than 20 miles an hour as they go by our house. And the second thing is we really don't like alcohol. It's against our religion, and we don't. And my friend said, oh, don't worry about that. Our company policy is no drinking on the job. And, okay, well, there's a couple of other things. One of them is we really don't like bad language, particularly don't want our children to hear bad language. Okay, well, they went and met with the drill crew and they briefed them on all of this stuff. And a week later, a bunch of big trucks barrel down the road at very high speed at midnight, and they throw empty liquor bottles out onto the porch of the house and scream a bunch of unprintable bad language as they drive by. And of course, my friend had to come down here to Colorado from Calgary and try to sort this out. And of course, the drill crew, we don't know anything about that. We have no idea who could have been doing that, right? So, all I'd say is, similar issue in Peru that set a mine back years in development, telling the drillers that you need to be polite, and these are very conservative places. And they stopped the truck with the drill rig in the middle of some little village, and the guy urinated on the side of the church. So one of the questions is, okay, we know we're supposed to do this, and we know we're supposed to manage with this, but if you're dealing with employees who have a rough kind of macho culture and they're used to operating in areas where there's nobody around supervising them, how do you manage to bring those values to play?
I can give at least 5 right off the top of my head right now that would emphasize that, including a whole group of cottage owners on Lake of the Woods, which is one of the preeminent pristine lakes crossing the border between Canada and the U.S. in northwestern Ontario. And there, a whole lot of cottages were built on some indigenous lands on a lease basis, and a road access was granted. But there was persistent complaints by the community that the expectation was not ever that they were going to be turning it into a major highway with huge dust, huge trucks, huge construction activities. And finally, a blockade came. So my point is only this: every time you turn around, roads are a first kind of ventricle through which you have to start managing the relations. And historically, The concern about building roads into the Canadian North or to any Indigenous community anywhere in the world has been that with the interaction provided by a road, bad things start happening in the community. And that's back into the 70s. That was one of the principal concerns that some of these northern communities had. Once we do that, then it becomes a delivery lane for every kind of social issue and the movement of drugs and alcohol. So the question really comes down to, are managing these things part of responsible mining? And in my view, it's obviously what they are, but that they're critical to that. And I express it in a different way. If you want to work on the big stuff, sweat the small stuff. That because
we're really onto something here. We look at the enormous uproar at the Yanacocha mine when there was this big mercury spill, right?
Yeah.
They had mercury produced at the mine, and they trucked it out, and they had contractors doing a lot of the work, so the Newmont could always say, well, it wasn't really us, it was the contractors, right? But the issue there was they were supposed to have 2 drivers in the truck so that the truck could just keep moving and it wouldn't have to stop, because the back of the truck was full of these giant flasks full of mercury, and they were very hazardous, right? So the protocol was you have 2 drivers, you drive. Well, the second driver isn't here. Well, let's just let Jose take this himself. And this guy who's driving winds up having stomach problems. He gets sick and he's exhausted. And so he stops at some village inn in this little town. And Newmont has made a great effort to brief people in all the villages around the mine about the dangers of mercury, but they haven't extended this program to the transportation corridors. So here are all of these flasks full of mercury, and while this guy's inside trying to sleep off his indigestion, one of them leaks and mercury starts to pour all over the road in front of this place, right? And the local villagers hear that, oh, mercury's what they use to get gold. And so this mercury, they're a gold company, the mercury's probably full of gold. So the local people went out and started trying to scoop up the mercury and take it home. And when the company came and started making announcements of, you must return the mercury, they thought it was because it was full of gold and the company wanted their money back, right? And so there was a real hard time getting people to return the mercury. At any rate, they're just these endless transportation corridor stories, right? And and they're really hard to make. Transportation corridors related to mining are probably the number one way that HIV spread in Southern Africa.
Right. So take another quick example here, because I'm going to use it to move in a different direction. So I've mentioned this mine before, Northern Vortex. It was a mine that was the fastest developed approval in an area between Acapulco and Mexico City. It was about a 14-month approval process, but I think I'd mentioned before in our conversations, Luke, that there was both a social manager given power to shut down the mine and a operations manager given power to shut down the mine. And again, the issue is around dust. A very senior lady's dog had been killed. The social manager was an astute guy. He's a Mexican from the area, I think, and he knew that this was a disaster. Once his dog had been killed by this elderly lady who lived for the dog, he shut down everything with the approval of the CEO, who I knew well, Dick Whittinger. But in any event, he then had to. He said the mine is only going to reopen when we have a dust plan, when all of the trucks are assembled in an assembly line first thing in the morning. There's going to be water tanks that are going to dust it at the beginning and dust it at the end, and all of the above. And he often used that as an example in some of those gem dialogues that we ran, as to the absolutely critical importance of jumping to the pump, so to speak, to use a metaphor, to get these issues under control quickly. And had he not had somebody like a social performance manager with that authority, that wouldn't have happened. That wouldn't have happened. And the point that he made in the course of our conversations over those dialogues, and he was an active part of several of them, Luke, because they were pretty remarkable over those 4 years. And using that video was a very powerful device for stimulating conversations where nobody was talking about some particular case study in which there was always going to be baggage. But in Dick's case, he said, the mining industry is enamored with NPV, net present value. That's their talisman. That's the big thing, net present value. He said, you know what I do? Whenever I walk into a room, I put a big S in the front of it. SNPV. And if it's zero, we're zero. And that was a powerful way of illustrating what he considered to be the absolutely crucial kind of importance to attach to little things, because people don't seem to get the fact that what's big to one person it might be little to another, but it's the little things that are a measure of whether the relationship is going to be substantial. Because if you can't take care of the little things, you've got a hell of a lot to worry about on the big things. And it just underscores the importance of moving beyond the trajectory from it's my way to we're going to inform and we're going to consult and we're going to give you feedback. If you're really going to create real value, you're going to have to take a look at what it takes to build a structure between and among a community and a group to build a sustainable relationship where you can start dealing upfront with this as an asset structure to really manage another asset, the gold or the mineralization in the property. But if you don't put that in, your risk factor keeps going down as your relationship quotient goes up on a steady trajectory.
So, question to you. Do we need to start making these agreements legally enforceable in a way that there's constant changes of management and ownership in the mining industry? Right?
Well,
and how do things survive that?
Well, I'll answer it completely differently. I don't think agreements are what you need. You certainly need agreements at some point, but what is much more fundamental is how you build a structure to ensure there is trust. What is trust? That is the question. And how do you build a structure to ensure you're capable of building, managing, and growing trust over the long term? Here's my answer to that. So when I walk into a situation, my goal is not to create a legal agreement. My goal is to create an explicit set of understandings about how we are going to manage a relationship that pivots off questions that I solicit from each of the parties as to what they think they have to talk about in order to have any substantial conversation. What is it that we need to be comfortable with in terms of our thing? Who needs to be there? Have we got the right people that are going to come and participate in this? Where are we going to have these conversations? How are we going to ensure that everybody is able to be in the conversation in an effective kind of way? How are we going to mutually agree on the information that's going to be? How are we going to ensure that we have an ongoing communication structure with each other? And I have then built what is basically an understanding that gives expression to clear expectations about how we're going to work with each other outside of any formal legal structure. because ultimately it's how you manage that ongoing relationship that is going to give the community the comfort. Most of these indigenous communities particularly are used to the world of protocols, and these have to be not based upon relationships between people, but the organizational structures. I won't go any further, but I create an actual structure to manage it, because the agreement is only as good as your ability to manage that social structure in an explicit way. And it has to have time. Every 6 months, we're going to look at each other. We're going to review. It requires an assiduous amount of effort to keep on managing that structure, keeping sure that the community is aware of things. The reality is that no matter what the agreement is, I've seen them. They can be knocked out. How are these people going to litigate any kind of an agreement in their own interest? They can't. They got to hire big lawyers. It turns it into a rights-based controversy. It's soon taken over by lawyers that are running the show. And there's no protection against the change of political leadership and everything. So you're basically trying to create a structure that is explicit, and it's a bit like a plane leaving the factory at Boeing. What's the first thing that has to happen before it leaves the airport? A maintenance contract has to be signed. There is no small way. You have to keep managing, building, and ensuring that relationship is owned, and it's got to be owned across the community. And unless that happens, I don't care what legal agreement you got, it's highly vulnerable over the long term.
So you sound very much like my friends at INMET, right? When you talk about we don't want the lawyers involved, and how could, it has to be based on trust and on relationships. What do you tell the community when the people they're used to dealing with aren't even there anymore?
Well, no, we're dealing with something different here. I'm talking about the front end. I'm talking about the legal agreement may need to be in place in respect to mutual investment, commitments around jobs, a variety of different commitments. And that's often the case even of a merger between two companies.
Right.
You have the lawyers gradually grinding to a close, and usually they end up arguing about a bunch of things. But if you haven't already started to create a fabric in which you're going to manage both labor unions as they start to merge and blend and manage that ongoing relationship, you can quickly find yourself poisoned by two lawyers that are fighting to close the deal. So what I'm talking about is a structure out front that is going to give concrete, and I don't use the term dialogue. I'm into agreement. I want an agreement around a clear set of expectations as to how we're going to manage that relationship, in which there's explicit written down understanding. And I've done this between two indigenous communities that have to be separate. I've used this 1,000 times.
So we may not be in disagreement, but my point is simply at the end of the road, when you've reached these agreements, which they had after painstaking dialogue, and they developed a lot of trust and understandings, but at the end of it, the company said, we don't want to make any of this in the form of binding agreements.
Well, then I think there's a problem. I mean, at the point at which you actually worked through, my only point is it's not sufficient to get a binding agreement without actually creating a significant structure around trust, not just having nice conversation. If all you're building trust on is some sense of dialogue, then I'm not in that game. The dialogue has to be leading to a structure that everybody understands is how we're going to work this thing, where there's clear expectation. That's what we really mean by trust. Yeah. And I'm not talking about just some endless dialogues and people making nice. I'm talking about something much more substantial at the front end.
Yeah, but when it does get to the point that people are making concrete commitments,
absolutely,
the road won't go here; it'll go over there, or whatever. At that point, the legal systems of rural areas in developing countries have so little legal infrastructure that the chances that somebody's going to file a lawsuit and get any relief are pretty limited, right?
Well, I can give you a concrete example of this. So there's a mine here in British Columbia, and there's a very, there's many of these benefit impact agreements, and this one was an early one, and it was quite substantial, and there was arguments being made that this commitment was not being made, this commitment was not being made, et cetera, and now there was noises that we're going to have to renegotiate the agreement. And the question that was put to me is, there's no bloody way by the company that I'm going to negotiate any agreement. Sigurdson, can you help us intervene with the community and somehow start working with them? Because we got to flush out what the problem is here, and it's not renegotiating no damn agreement. And I went in there 2 times over 2 years and basically conducted a conversation involving all of the players. And what it turned out is that the basic failure had been the failure to keep communicating and integrating. And I had meetings of the management team and the other team. And the issues were not about what ostensibly appeared to be. And you can ask the same of many people, like Brent Bergeron. I dealt with him up in Quebec, the same thing. The strength of your ability to manage those issues is critical to being able to deal with any legalisms. If the only thing you resort to is the legalisms, it's hopeless. You have to have some kind of a structure as to, how you're going to anticipate these issues arising. And so dialogue and nice talk and all that, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about building something much more concrete, which can be called a trust protocol. Clear.
All right. So here's my big question to you, right? Is I've learned so much from you over the years, and I think your ideas about dialogue processes and how negotiations work and all this stuff are really, really wonderful. But the question is, okay, in Colombia alone, there are several hundred Indigenous consultations going on right now. Question is, how do we mass produce people with your set of skills? You personally can't be leading the negotiation process. And I see people who really don't have any understanding of the kind of principles you're talking about trying to lead negotiation processes, and they're leading a lot of them over the cliff. How do we build more professionals who have the necessary set of skills?
Well, I don't want to make this about me and my approach. I've already done too much of that kind of talking in the course of these discussions. And I'm not pretending to have any perfect answer to this, but I guess that was the very question that we addressed when in 1994 we said that sustainability is as much about how we interact with each other and organize our corporate and community structures to be able to find ways to live and work together, and developed a set of principles as to what we believed would be the kinds of guidelines that can be taken into any project, any community, any watershed that would jumpstart and have some transparency connected and authenticity because of the way they were created, to have a conversation that would lead to the kind of structures that I'm talking about. And that was the entire process that we were into in 1994, and it's probably worthwhile reviewing and reconsidering that, because I can tell you that it's extremely powerful to walk into a company, community, others, and say, well, here's a set of principles that were developed in this way and that way. Do you think this is something that we could use to start jump-starting our conversation? And one of the key elements of that is co-design of the way we're going to work together. And unless people own the way, they're not going to be real committed to the outcome. So that was the entire goal that we had, to see sustainability as an exercise in how we get people to live and work together in spite of their differences in values. And it's easier to do that in the context of a mine or a fishing operation or something on the ground. It's more tangible. And how do you get to ensure that the government and other players that need to be there and giving effect to any outcomes are part of it? So that was exactly where we were in 1994. The exact question you asked, And the exact reason, we spent 3 years negotiating that set of principles, and it was that set of principles that went into Peru. And I can tell you, in 2014, when I was back in Peru for about about a month, all of the people that were working in that, they came up to me and said, "Are you the guy that brought all those principles here?" I swear. And that was at Lima conference. So I think that the only way is, just like we focused on all these other things, we haven't focused enough, in my view, on the how of sustainability. And I'm going to send you a piece after that describes my view as to what it really takes to build sustainable relationships and sustainable principles. But we were looking at how you took sustainability from some abstract set of conversations about defining it, the policies, the platforms, the standards, etc., and said, no, how do you actually do it? How do you actually make it happen? How do you start? And that was exactly where Brundtland was saying. Human behavior is going to influence it. But none of our discussion around responsible mining has probably fully embraced, when it comes to standards and expectations, the how.
And one of the things I'd say about standards is, and law in general, is that no set of standards can anticipate every single issue that's going to come up. And really the question is, when something comes up that isn't adequately dealt with by the standard, how are we going to behave?
How are we going to behave? Exactly.
Part of that is condition. Part of that is our own values. What do I believe? And part of it is the relationship we've built that allows us to discuss and overcome differences when. But so, look, I wanted to ask you what your thought is. I get from colleagues who work in the human rights field all the time, I get really a lot of push about rights-based approaches, right? Everything has to be based on understood rights. You've mentioned rights a little bit earlier. What's the role of rights?
Rights is power. Rights is power. It's that simple. A right changes the power equation, and that's what's been going on in the last 40 years of my career. When I first started acting for Aboriginal interests, I was in the rights business, but there wasn't much clarity around what the rights were. There wasn't much clarity around whether or not we were going to be able to stop that big hydroelectric project. There wasn't much clarity around anything as to what obligations people had as a matter of human rights, as they were flooding 12,000 people or else putting them into drought on opposite sides of the dam. But 12,000 people were being affected. So I thought a lot about that. The question is, how do I turn whatever ostensible rights are out there, the possibility of crystallizing a right in a court, into a result? So I'm in the business of turning rights into results. And at that point, I've got to be very pragmatic. The rights can't solve a fishing problem with moss in the nets coming out of Lake Winnipeg onto the Nelson River going to the Churchill Bay. They can't deal with the trapline problem. They can't deal with guys in slush as they're going along after 5 feet of ice becomes 5 inches overnight in the wintertime. So I quickly learned that I had to think about how I was going to negotiate those issues against the backdrop of rights. And slowly, then I was creating the likelihood of power, the possibility. There was as much worry, actually, in that sense, about the optics of drowning out graveyards, and that was certainly something that worried. The optics of that were not good, so there was public relations. So alongside rights, we have other forms of power that you're more than familiar with in Latin America, that as people moved from the transistor radio to learning about what the hell was going on in the rest of the world to where we are today, and everybody knows that they got rights somewhere or another, and the whole atmosphere and rights have got solidified in many parts of the world around Indigenous issues. So it's the oldest story in the book. To be taken seriously, to have a serious conversation, you have to be taken seriously. And it's real serious if you don't have a right as a backdrop. But this is about the power. So in the world that I live in, I'm always watching power circulating around, and as power changes, opportunities and possibilities change. The danger is that if you suction the whole world into a rights-based discussion and a legal context, and you can't seem to work by ambidextrously with both hands, you're not going to get where you need to go. And we watched that in labor law, in the early 70s and 80s and 90s. We pretty quickly suctioned that whole world into a rights-based world with long, complicated arbitrations, getting nowhere. Somehow we've got to be able to move an understanding that you have to use, how you use your power, whether it's company or whatever, is critical. So that's how I see rights. And I get extremely worried as we suction this whole world into a rights-based discussion when soon it's in the hands of lawyers who control it. Lawyers have their proper role. Lawyers have many roles, but in the front end of managing difficult conversations around these complicated issues, they need to be kept in the background until there's something to put onto paper that needs to be crystallized in some way. They are some of my biggest problems over my career, some of the biggest problems. I often, to go on for a little longer, I walk into rooms and all I see is vacuum cleaners. Everybody's vacuuming the world into the way they like to see it, their tools, their power, their practices, their world is the world that they see, and I'm wandering into the middle of it. And oftentimes I look at the lawyer and they're the noisiest vacuum cleaner, because they chill everything. Once the lawyer starts saying that it's illegal, oh yeah, well, the whole world is stopped in its tracks, you know. So I've had some interesting discussions with lawyers. Very.
Well, you know,
sorry to go on, but I mean, once you get me going on this topic, Luke, I'm quite dangerous.
yeah, well, look, so you are a lawyer and you're talking to a lawyer right now.
Yeah.
You know, there's one more issue that I would like to talk about, which is how do we deal with community-based issues in an environment where government is profoundly undemocratic, right? Where you're in a country that is run by a dictator, where there's no real recourse through any independent court system. There's no freedom of speech. How do you operate in that kind of an environment responsibly as a mining company? And how do you try to work with communities in that kind of an environment?
Well, that's a nice, simple question to kind of start winding our conversation down. I'm only hoping that you've asked that rhetorically and you're about to answer it.
I don't think so. It's extremely it's extremely difficult. And one of the issues, of course, has to be, do companies have some kind of red line where they say, beyond this kind of situation, beyond this line, we're not going to go, right? And as long as you have companies who want to jump into these places and operate there, you're going to have this issue come up, and it's extremely difficult and challenging, because we come up with all these ideas about how we can have sustainable mining or responsible mining, or mining consistent with principles of sustainable development. But then, we wind up trying to operate in regions where, I just got through with a project last week where I was trying to find out what the legislation of this country required of mining companies in a certain area. And I wound up being told by a government official that the legislation is classified. Right? I mean, the law is classified. You can't see the law. I wonder about that.
Well, understandably, but let's just back up a little bit I mean, in Canada, the front end duty of engagement and discharging the duty to consult with these communities is still the government. That's what has been decided in the courts. But the front end reality is that a company has a powerful interest in managing and being actively engaged in any of these interactions with the community itself. But government itself, whether it's under an authoritarian or a democratic rule, is such a large, cumbersome instrument in itself, whatever its ultimate disposition is, from a top-down point of view. And that's part of the problem. Just like business units in a company, you have so many different ministries that have overlapping jurisdictions. Then you have on top of that different states and provinces, and all of them have concurrent jurisdictions. This is like a landmine in Canada with all these cross jurisdictions. And that's the same, including the Indigenous jurisdiction now with respect to rights. Then you have municipalities. So any of these problems that I get involved in the middle of, or you get involved in, the background is a highly cumbersome elephant-like structure that is very difficult to manage around the problem, because the ostensible problem is not the real problem. It's not the mine. It's all the cultures of decision-making around the mine, and the government is the most impossible to manage. And it's really about managing government. No, sincerely. That is the biggest issue. And governments are not proactive, they're reactive. They will follow a lead, and if they can see it's safe, they will go there. So just to make that point, I call government too small a word for too big a thing. It just doesn't work. So that problem is also a problem inside a highly structured dictatorial country, is all I'm making. I'm not suggesting there's something different, but I don't think you can take the word government as if it's something that you can get a handle on. So many of these things are seduced by words that create simplicity. The government. Oh, the government. Well, what is it? We need to trust the government. Governments can't trust. Governments can only express themselves through legislation. Who is it that you're trusting? And the legislation can change. So that's why this word trust just drives me crazy. I'm always asking people, what do you distrust? Give me an example. And usually it's, well, this guy did something to me. He hit me from behind, whatever the hell it is. And so so much of this gets blurred up in words that mean absolutely nothing to me. And government and trust is an oxymoron if there ever was one. The honor of the crown. Well, maybe in the time of King George VI in 1760, maybe we had it then. So I'm just a bit more cynical about government writ widely. Then there's the other issue about distribution of benefits. You made that point earlier, Luke. These folks are getting all the benefit at the local community, and so the government should get all the money. Yeah. You don't need to be a dictatorial government to do that. I want all the money here. Peru has got some other thing. They've got that slice of money that comes into some kind of a fund, and then they haven't been able to figure out how to use the damn money. It's just piling up in these funds that aren't accessible, that are being paid by the community. So let's not just talk about dictatorial. Let's just talk about government. It has to be there. We have to have government. But then in northeastern BC, the other problem we've got is that the government is both the regulator and the developer.
Right.
They're making a lot of money out of leases.
That's one of the real concerns about socialism. We talked about that earlier. Some people have said that all of the problems result from the profit motive and the fact that things are privately owned, and the whole idea of private property, and that really if we had government-owned state corporations working for the benefit of everyone, that these problems would all go away. I will say I was quite surprised at a research project we did in Central America. The mining property had been privately owned, but it was expropriated by the government and turned into a state enterprise. Well, they then returned to a free market system and re-privatized the mine. And we went down and interviewed all kind of people, and the company was just full of, what a wonderful job we've done. The place was polluting, the contamination was terrible, the worker safety was terrible. There were all kind of accidents, and we've got a really great worker safety record. We've got less water pollution, and to top it all off, under the government ownership, it lost money all the time, and at the end of the day, we're making money. So everything is much better. Then we went into the village, and they said, well, the wages are a lot higher now for the people who have work. But there were 2,000 jobs before, and there are 180 jobs. Right. We would rather have it the old way. We'd rather have 2,000 jobs, even at poorly paid and even with environmental problems and worker safety issues.
I completely agree. I guess just to, as we sort of wind down perhaps this aspect of the conversation, the point that you made earlier about subsidiarity is a really important one, because if you're able to get lower to the ground, there's a greater accountability between people that live in a local region. If they're making their living and working there, and the company manager and everything, life becomes more manageable because it's more interconnected. You're not as distant as in the city. So just by virtue of proximity, people have a sense of accountability. They meet in the curling rink, or they meet on the football field, or they meet here. And they all have to live and work, their kids working. So in some of these things, by going there, then I do believe that so much change can happen within organizational structures like companies, which have the capability. But do they have the right degree of training and competencies that would enable them to take on board some of these issues? Because most people, no matter where they are, they tend to be victimized by whatever they think is their responsibility in the organization, and they aren't given the license to think that they own sustainability. It's like that guy that I mentioned to you in the course that I was teaching, and he was the mine manager of a big mine, I think in the Elk Valley, and at the end of the week, his nugget was, I'm a human being first, I'm an engineer second, Glenn. I learned that. And that was remarkable. But that he suddenly realized, well, I'd allowed myself to get vacuum cleanered into thinking that I can't use my bloody judgment. I'm a farm kid from Saskatchewan originally. Where did I go wrong? And I think that if we actually focus in, and that's one of the things that when we were building that CSR counselor operation, there's all kinds of challenges working that kind of a structure to examining inappropriate activity in a Mexican mine. We can try or whatever, but you need a huge infrastructure, just like the World Bank's Ombudsman Office. You can't just do that with $500,000 a year in Canada. But you can start focusing on the competency development and the values and the attitudes inside the organizations that are Canadian. I mean, you can begin at home. I kind of on the theory that begin at home, and then we can move out from there. Don't take on the world before you take on your backyard, and that is becoming an issue now, though, because Canadian firms that are very proactive are finding that there is an expectation that they behave in exactly the same way internationally, because all these people are connected now. Everybody knows everything. That's what I assume today.
Wow, what a powerful conversation today. We heard Glenn and Luke share stories that illustrate both the successes and failures of corporate sustainability efforts, from short-term financial pressures to the importance of building trust with local communities. It's clear that sustainability reporting alone is not enough. It's about how companies manage relationships, respond to challenges, and make decisions that impact the long term.
Absolutely, Monica. I found it particularly interesting how the smallest issues, like dust from trucks, can lead to much larger problems if not managed properly. It really drives home the point that sustainability isn't just what's written in a report, but how it's lived out every day on the ground. A big thanks to Glenn and Luke, as always, for sharing their insights, and of course, to our listeners for tuning in. Their dialogue underscored the importance of competency development, integrating sustainability into core company values, and enhancing transparency to promote responsible and sustainable mining operations.
Thanks again to Glenn and Luke, and thank you, our listeners, for joining us. Remember, sustainability is not just about a buzzword. It's a commitment that requires all of us to think critically and act responsibly. We hope today's episode has given you some food for thought. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.
Just as a teaser, the next episode in this series brings together everything we've discussed so far: environmental responsibility, community engagement, global standards, and the future of mining. How can the lessons of the past guide us towards a more sustainable and equitable future? We will examine the evolving challenges in mining management and community engagement, focusing on the critical role of trust and cultural sensitivity in consultations. So join us for this in-depth conversation as we reflect on the challenges and opportunities ahead for the mining industry.